Hello, good afternoon. Today, our guest is Professor John Majewski. Hello, John. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
So, John, we're going to be talking about slavery and its relationship to innovation. Some years ago, you produced a paper titled Schumpeterian Slavery. Is the name right?
Yeah, well, I call it Schumpeterian capitalism, and it's basically trying to make a difference or distinguish between Northern capitalism before the Civil War and Southern slave capitalism before the Civil War. And that Northern capitalism was much more focused on invention, innovation, and creativity than the South slave economy. And so trying to kind of like make that distinction really clear. Sometimes it gets blurred in the current literature.
Slavery. Because of the new economic history of capitalism, many are arguing that in the past, slavery anchored the American economy. And I have written several articles debunking this notion. And interestingly, I have a piece to be published soon. And I cite your latest article in that piece. And it is well, the new piece that will be published soon is actually a report on your article. It's a short piece, and your article is titled Economic Creativity in a Slave Economy, Invention and Innovation in Slave Cities Before the Civil War. So, John, one can make a compelling argument to indicate that slave plantations were profitable, but few actually study the unseen costs of slavery. If one has the potential to become a manufacturer or an artist and he inherits a slave plantation, is going to invest in slavery. And as such, resources are diverted to less productive sectors. Do you agree?
Yes, generally, I certainly agree that it's like, my research, I find that slave cities in particular are remarkably less inventive, less creative than free labor cities in the North. And there's a wide variety of measures which show this, whether it's patenting rates, whether it's exhibits at major industrial fairs, whether it's the location of particularly creative industries like musical instruments or furniture making. And so kind of like my argument is that it's clearly something is going on, that slavery really gets in the way of widespread economic creativity. And kind of the specific mechanism that I tend to highlight and focus on is education and literacy, that in the slave economy, widespread literacy can be dangerous from the perspective of the enslaver, who is, has to worry about slave revolts or challenges to their political power if there's widespread literacy. And so the much different educational systems and much higher rates of literacy in the North, as well as like formation of institutions such as libraries, I think makes a big difference between the Northern economy and the Southern slave economy before the Civil War.
And what people often do not mention about slavery is that it deprived America of the ingenuity of blacks. The invention of a slave could not be patented.
Absolutely. And so it does appear that at the margins, there were, enslaved workers who contributed to inventions like the cotton gin, but they were rarely credited with it in any manner, if ever. And you're absolutely right. It was almost impossible for an enslaved person to get a patent on an invention. And in fact, there was one famous case in which an enslaver tried to patent an invention that was developed by an enslaved person, and the patent office refused on the grounds that it wasn't the enslaver who had actually done the invention. And this became kind of, a well-known issue in the 1850s. The differential patenting rate between the slave South and the free labor North. And so the fact that the enslaved population, the Black population is, has obviously low rates of literacy, little opportunity to invent, is a huge economic long-term problem, and that continues well after the Civil War, where patenting rates are lower because of violence, racism, and lack of educational opportunities on the part of Black population relative to whites.
Enslaved societies did not permit a wide-scale consumer class. Blacks during slavery in the Caribbean and in the American South were involved in the internal marketing system. But if they were free people, they would have made more money and as such would have been a better position to act as consumers.
Yeah, that's right, and I think that's an important factor, as well as education is like, particularly in industries that rely on like a large middle class. It seems like the slave South is well behind the North. So two industries in particular stand out in this regard. Musical instruments, which is actually a really fast growing industry in the 1840s and 1850s, especially pianos, which are increasingly popular among urban middle class consumers. The piano industry is almost exclusively located in the North, and it's precisely because it's close to sources of demand, right? The big urban middle class. Another example is the publishing industry, which is a very fast growing industry. There's an explosion of books and periodicals and all sorts of publications. And that is, again, overwhelmingly located in the North as opposed to the South, because the North has these millions of middle class readers. And so it creates the incentive for entrepreneurs to kind of expand of production and to kind of like meet different segments of market demand. And that just doesn't exist in the slave South. And so I do think like demand is an important part of the equation as well, definitely.
And was it a safer option for planters to capture the rents of slavery? And by rents of slavery, we're referring to political privileges bestowed on planters because they formed an influential political group. So if slavery was abolished, the plantocracy would decline in importance. So if you are a planter, it at the time it would have made more sense to invest in incremental innovations than to finance Schumpeterian innovation, because Schumpeterian innovations can destroy the industry. And if slavery is no longer relevant, your political clout will decline.
Yeah, that's right. And so if from the enslaving class is actually very innovative when it comes to plantation agriculture itself and industries that are directly related to it. And I think historians have shown that many enslavers could be quite entrepreneurial. And so, like historian Daniel Rood, for example,
I was just about to
shows
mention him.
that. What's that?
I was just about to mention Daniel.
Yeah, and so I think his work is really like fascinating in showing that planters in Virginia, kind of built this kind of like large scale grain milling complex that shipped grain, as far away as Brazil, and it was kind of the grain that was milled in Richmond had a reputation for incredibly high quality. But the issue for the South is that it's very difficult to sustain any kind of like innovation and invention outside of plantation agriculture. And and I think there are these kind of like political factors like education. There are the economic factors like demand. Some people have argued that enslavers feared that widespread industrialization would pose a threat to their political power. I think there may be something to that in some cases. There were certainly other enslavers who argued, well, widespread manufacturing, if we can control it, will benefit us in the long term and will make slavery stronger. But translating that vision into reality was far more difficult than they imagined. And so the slave South continually lagged behind in manufacturing, especially highly creative manufacturing that required a great deal of invention and innovation.
John, poor whites also were poor whites were also disprivileged by the slave system. Slavery did not benefit poor whites, and as you are articulating, slave societies really invested substantial funds in literacy. So why was that the case? Why did slave societies ignore widespread literacy?
Yeah, so there's a couple different factors. So one kind of like widely noted factor, which I actually don't attach that much importance to myself, is that, well, this is an agricultural economy and education and literacy is not as important in agricultural economies as manufacturing economies. Well, it turns out that the Midwest is overwhelmingly agricultural at this time. There's certainly some manufacturing in some cities like, you know, Cincinnati and Chicago, but it's overwhelmingly rural, agricultural, and yet it invests a lot in education in a way that the slave South does not. And so one of the things I kind of investigate is that the idea that in a slave society, literacy becomes a privilege, and that the enslaving class is fearful of widespread literacy, especially if it isn't sure if it has kind of like complete control of the state apparatus of government. And so kind of like the fear of the enslaving class is that you have an educated class of white workers, and this launches like reform movements and our abolitionist movements, our women's rights movements, or, you know, any kind of reform movement that might challenge the power of the enslaving class. Now, towards this, as we get closer to the Civil War, you do see some slave states make incremental improvements in their educational system. And kind of my argument is that they feel increasingly comfortable doing so because they have stronger control of their state governments, and they're imagining a future in which they control their own national government as well. And then education becomes a little bit safer among whites because they feel they will have political control regardless. But when they are fearful about losing political control, then they're really worried about widespread education. And so for most of the first half of the 19th century, they invest little in education for poor whites.
John, was the labor of working class whites uncompetitive because of slave labor? Is this why working class whites, or should I say poor whites, did so poorly during slavery?
That was a popular abolitionist argument, certainly. That you know, the argument is that if in a slave society, hard work becomes devalued because that is the work of the slave. And so therefore, you know, there's kind of like this kind of widespread lack of interest in kind of like hard work and initiative and other values that many Northerners associate with economic progress. I think there's something to that, but I think it's easily exaggerated. And I think many poor whites actually worked quite hard and struggled, but it was just, you know, a real uphill battle in a society in which there isn't like this great demand to spur industry, where there isn't interest in education. And so there is a lack of dynamism for those reasons. And so I would tend to associate the lack of economic development in the South not with the fact that slavery made all labor somehow disrespectful in the South, but more along the lines that, you know, you have these specific mechanisms that work through, say, demand are through education.
Well, this argument was actually refuted years ago by some economists who note that the existence of labor does not discourage other people from laboring. However, there is some anecdotal evidence to suggest that in some societies, because of the legacy of slavery, people are less inclined to work. But again, it is anecdotal evidence and exaggerated, as you said. But what I'm really asking is if the existence of slave labor depressed the wages of white working class people. So if you can get slave labor, are you still willing to employ whites? This is the question I'm really posing.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. And so there's a new paper out by economic historian Paul Rohde and his co-author. He's at the University of Michigan. And what um, the argument there is that if you actually compare slave areas and free labor areas at the border of the North and the South, and like states like Kentucky and Delaware, or even like Missouri, it actually turns out that wages are higher for whites in those areas.
In
And
what eras? In the slave eras?
yes, in the slave areas. And the argument that is made is that because people, didn't want to work in a slave economy because you could be drafted into the militia, because there were widespread censorship, or because, some people just didn't want to work with Blacks, whether they were enslaved or free. And so they actually had to pay higher wages to attract workers in these areas, which is, I think, a fascinating finding and counterintuitive. But it makes sense that, and I think it goes to your point that, there are obviously some workers who will resent being in a slave society because of the extra cost being in such a society imposes. You can, kind of like the external cost of slavery, like having to be part of the slave patrol, or having to be part of the state militia, or, there's a feeling of like censorship, because it's actually legal to be anti-slavery or an overt abolitionist in many slave states. And so that's are some of the kinds of, kind of like what the latest research indicates.
Yeah,
And,
Paul Rood.
that finding makes intuitive sense to
Yeah,
me.
I do follow Paul Rood. John, should we revisit the writings of Eugene Genovese? Can we truly say that slave owners were bourgeois or capitalists in a contemporary sense?
It depends all on how you define capitalism, right? And so they were motivated, they were entrepreneurial, they did well within their own realm. But if you define capitalism in a Schumpeterian sense of like widespread innovation, widespread invention, this sense of kind of like creative destruction, then I think you can make a stronger case that actually the enslavers were not capitalist or even anti-capitalist to a certain extent. And so, this is like, age-old question: how do we define capitalism, right? So in some ways, I think you can make a strong argument. Yeah, they were definitely capitalist, but in other ways, they were not. And one of the things that I'm kind of like playing around with is this Schumpeterian phrase, creative destruction. And that's something you're fearful of if you're an enslaver, right? Because you may want some change at the margin to make slavery more productive, but you're not interested in widespread change that could challenge slavery. And so it's fascinating that, from the colonial period up through the Civil War, the central economic organization of slave states is the plantation, right? And that's like in a continuity, whereas if you think about the North, there's this immense structural change happening throughout the economy, which reflects this Schumpeterian type of capitalism in which there's lots of invention and innovation.
Slave owners were rent-seeking capitalists. Based on the data based on the data that we're now exploring across the globe during slavery, slave owners were likely to subscribe to journals and they invested in agricultural science. So obviously they were serious about quality control. But to what extent did they want disruption? This is debatable. So in the Schumpeterian sense, they were not capitalists, but I would refer to slave owners as rent-seeking capitalists. It's just like in 21st century capitalism, some companies, because of government privileges, they get they become monopolies, and as such they fear competition because competition will make them redundant. So we can well, interestingly, John, I've never seen a paper comparing the rent-seeking model of plantation owners to the monopolistic attitudes of businessmen in the 20th century or the 19th century.
Yeah, I think as an analogy, there's something to it. And so one of the things that I find fascinating about Southern enslavers is that we have this idea that they were actually anti-government, anti-state. And that's actually not the case at all. They were very pro-state. They needed a state to help enforce slavery. The classic example is the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which forced Northerners to return escaped slaves and had like its own system of judges and federal marshals to do that. And that was like the number one reason Southerners gave for secession, the failure of the North to return fugitive slaves, right? And so there is this sense where enslavers definitely want a big, powerful state to back their interests. And this was a key motivation of the Confederacy. And I think that kind of like works with this idea that in the late 19th century, 20th century, so forth, there are certainly many capitalist enterprises that want that state intervention in order to secure markets and to prevent competition. And so I think there's something to that comparison, definitely.
And John, during slavery, there was little in terms of product differentiation. Remember, plantations in the American South and the British West Indies were not competing against each other. They were competing to secure a larger share of the export market. So if plantation A produced sugar, it was simply sugar or sugar of a particular brand, meaning refined sugar or beet sugar, not necessarily a company-like brand. So for example, John Brown plantation did not produce John Brown sugar. So in that sense, slavery was not catering to the unique peculiarities of consumers.
Right, and I think that goes along with that kind of issue of demand, right? That there isn't widespread kind of like consumer demand or as widespread consumer demand in slave societies as opposed to free labor societies. And there's actually kind of a really interesting environmental component to that as well. The soils in the South tend to be very acidic. And so there is more kind of like wasteland and farms and plantations in the South than in the North, which works the lower population densities. So I do think it's kind of like an interesting point about there's less concern about like thinking about consumers in a slave society. And perhaps that goes back to the fact that they're kind of like, growing these crops in which kind of like the final consumer demand from the standpoint of the individual producer isn't that important. Now, the flip side of that, I know that in some areas of agriculture, like tobacco, like producing exactly the right type of tobacco with the right kind of taste is super important. And so kind of like how you cure the tobacco is really important. And so there you would see kind of like more of a connection between what enslavers are doing and kind of consumer demand. But I would agree that it's much less so than say a northern manufacturer.
And also, is there a link between slavery and diminished soil quality?
Yeah, so my sense is that that's more related to the environment rather than agricultural practices. And so there is kind of like an abolitionist slash neo-abolitionist critique of enslavers that they wear out the land, right? And this is why um, uh, some people like Abraham Lincoln believed if you restricted the spread of slavery over time, you would ultimately kill slavery because the enslavers would exhaust the soil. I think that argument's overstated, and if you look at like soil maps, it's clear that the soils, most areas of the South are quite acidic, and they're not so much wearing out the land. Is that the enslavers have to engage in a form of shifting cultivation, which commonly referred to as slash and burn agriculture, where you kind of burn a piece of land of the trees, which provides kind of like calcium in the ash to neutralize these acidic soils. And then after 5 years, you have to move to another plot of land because over time, that calcium is depleted. And so from my perspective, it's more environment than it is like kind of enslavers over farming the land, but it's certainly that's one of the issues that's debated.
Slavery occupied a less prestigious role in the manufacturing value chain. So I don't know if you are aware, but there's two new studies done by an economist, a European economist, published by Taylor and Francis. And the is arguing that the value added component of the plantation complex is over 10%. And I do respect his research and the methodology. But if you dig deeper into the research, it is evident that the human capital component of the value chain is not as a result of slavery.
Right. Yeah. It's that. It sounds like an interesting paper. I don't know it, and so I'd have to kind of like take a look at it and think about it before I can
Yes.
give any kind of like definitive or real answer to it. But it
Yeah,
sounds like a fascinating paper.
it is, and it is special. It is fascinated in light of the new economic history of capitalism and the dependency school. So there's the old narrative that slavery locked countries in the Caribbean into the export trap. This is posited by the dependency school and other left-leaning economists, and many argue that the gains of the slave trade were underestimated. The original argument is that the gains of the slave trade were small, but revisionist literature is asserting that the value added component of the slave trade is inflating the gains. And I'm interested in the argument from a human capital standpoint. That's why I brought it up.
Right. Yeah. No. And I think kind of like the dependency school, I think is kind of like um, interesting in that I kind of like, have in my own kind of work, rejected it. And just because it's like, well, like the Midwest, you could say was like dependent as an agricultural export region, but it made the transition just fine into like the major manufacturing area. So why not these other areas? I do think I'm more inclined to say there's something to it. And I think you're right that it goes back to kind of like, kind of like investment in human capital, investment in education and skills that kind of like the, the South, which I know best, remains consistently behind in terms of like education, library formation, access to information, publishing industries, all those things related to kind of like, knowledge that we associate with invention and innovation. And that's why I think it gets locked into kind of like cotton and kind of like this export economy to the extent that it does. But it's not like inherent that once you're a dependent region or an agricultural export region, you're always that way. But I do think if you kind of like fail to invest in kind of like widespread education, that eventually you'll get locked into certain kinds of industries.
The dependency school was innovative at a point in time. It's no longer that popular, but based on my analysis of the data, for the most part, the dependency school is inapt. Belgium and Germany industrialized before without colonies. According to Paul Bayrock, there's a negative relationship between colonial position and economic growth, and the best literature on the slave trade argues that the gains were small.
Right.
So I'm yet to see compelling literature produced by the dependency school to reorient my opinions.
Yeah, that's right. And again, it's the United States that I kind of know
Yes.
best, and it is certainly the case that there were lots of banks that made money from the slave trade and from cotton, and many manufacturers who benefited from lower cotton prices, lower tobacco prices, commodity prices in general. But it's really hard to make that claim, to say that capital was therefore responsible for the really widespread innovation and invention. And employment in cotton industries is less than 10% of all kind of manufacturing employment, much less overall employment. And so it's an important sector, but it's certainly not like a dominant sector. And kind of like the real mark of a successful innovative economy is this widespread diffusion of invention and innovation, which makes it kind of like hard to kind of like say that it was the profits of cotton and the profits of slavery that resulted in industrialization, or was like particularly critical for innovation. Certainly true for some industries, but not across the board.
Paul Rode and Alan Olmsted, they also have a paper critiquing the new economic history of capitalism, and they repeat your points. Cotton, the reputation of cotton has been exaggerated.
Yeah, I think that's right. You might be able to kind of like construct some sort of story that cotton was particularly important early on in like the 1810s, 1820s, and that the cotton industry therefore kind of like trained like entrepreneurs and skilled mechanics and artisans who then went into other industries. I don't think that the evidence really supports that industrialization is so widespread. And, and so, for example, most textile firms use water power, but a major source of invention and innovation is the steam engine, right? And so it's kind of really hard to kind of connect slavery and cotton with widespread invention and innovation. And so I would agree, it's like cotton's obviously important, but it's not as critical, I think, as some
Yeah,
historians have
and
made it out to be.
innovations in agriculture, as Rode and co-author note again, was driven by biological innovations, not slave labor.
Right, and so I do think there are some industries where you see like dominated by slavery that do have linkages to kind of like technologically progressive industries, like whether it's grain or sugar. But I think those are pretty rare and exceptional. And again, there's usually like a direct link back to the plantation, but that's way different than what happens in the North, where you have like many different sources of invention and innovation. You have many like ordinary artisans, become inventors. You have like a range of different industries coming up across the board. which makes it far more widespread than what happens with plantation agriculture in the
Yeah,
South.
and moreover, America was a latecomer to the cotton industry, wasn't she?
Yes, that relatively late, certainly compared to Britain, definitely. And it's, you can make also the argument that, cotton was important as a key export. In fact, it was the United States' #1 export, and those earnings from those exports were important to the general economy. And my answer to that is that yes, cotton was certainly a key export and important to certain merchants and financiers. But that what was really key for the United States from the 1830s to the Civil War was more internal development, was kind of like the spread west and kind of like the creation of this home market in a way, domestic market. And so I think even in that regard, the links between cotton and the European economy, especially the British economy, are somewhat overrated from the standpoint of American economic development.
John, you're an expert in Southern history. I am not an expert. So this is a question that I'm going to ask. Is there anything else that you would like to tell us about the Southern economy post-slavery?
Yeah, this is something that I'm investigating more and like I'm kind of like really interested in the legacy of slavery in the South as a whole. And it's really interesting that just as Southern cities were lagging well behind Northern cities in invention in 1860, the preliminary evidence I've analyzed for 1900 shows the same pattern. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s considered the South the nation's #1 economic problem. I think it's somewhat of an exaggeration, but I do think kind of like the Southern economy develops along different lines than the rest of the US economy. And I really do think there is a long legacy of slavery that's a part of that. And so the issues with the slave economy simply don't end when slavery is abolished during the Civil War, but continue on for many generations.
I agree. And furthermore, Gavin Wright, he has a new paper out, and his argument is quite simple. Growth did not discontinue after the abolition of slavery, and this is significant in the context of the new economic history of capitalism debate, because it is disproving the notion that the American economy needed slavery.
Oh, right. I mean, and I think kind of like the new historians of capitalism have kind of come around to that idea. And so they're emphasizing more early industrialization and say pre-1840. But it's clear by 1860 that the Northern economy is sufficiently large and dynamic that slavery isn't all that important. And the fact that the North is willing to go to war to stop the spread of slavery suggests that slavery isn't that economically important to the nation, at least to the North, by 1860. And this is kind of like, what a number of historians have pointed out is a difficult problem for the new capitalism of historians is if really Southern slavery is critical to Northern capitalism, then why is the North willing to kind of like go to war to prevent the spread of slavery? It's not intuitively obvious why that's the case.
And John, so in your article on page 15, there's the headline explaining the gap in commercialized creativity. And I'm going to refresh your memory so that you can comment. Why exactly did slave cities trail their free labor counterparts in these measures of commercialized creativity, and we're referring to artistic creativity and the rates of patenting. Perhaps the evident lack of economic creativity in southern cities was a rational response to the great profitability of cotton, slavery, and plantations. With slavery removing the labor constraints on farm size, it is possible that the creative talent in the slave states gravitated towards staple agriculture, while creative talent in free labor states moved to industry and cities to escape the entrepreneurial limitations of the family farm. We already discussed this part of the debate, so we're not going to rush it. So I'm going to continue. Creative entrepreneurial talent should have gravitated to slave cities such as Richmond, Baltimore, and Louisville, yet these still generated low levels of economic creativity. Such arguments also assume that free labor farmers lacked creativity when there is substantial evidence that they were just as creative as southern enslavers. No, you can expound.
Yeah, so kind of like, you can make, as I said in the paper, an argument, well, slavery makes plantations really profitable, and so that's going to put your creative labor there. Whereas in the North, there's always this labor constraint on agriculture. There's only so much you can harvest because it's hard, relatively difficult to hire wage workers out with the harvest. It's expensive. And so there are real limits in terms of how much you can grow and how large your farm could be, which would deflect, kind of like creative talent into industry. So a couple of problems with that. One big problem is that, well, Northern agriculture is also like really innovative. And so kind of like if you're thinking a dichotomy between, either agriculture is creative or industry is creative. That's not true in the North. In the North, they go hand in hand. And so there are a lot of many different innovations in Northern agriculture. The reaper, the mechanical reaper being like a preeminent example, which helped mechanize the harvesting operations, which then lowered that labor constraint and allowed somewhat larger, more efficient grain farming. But in the South, it does seem like there is that dichotomy, right? Of like you have this kind of like productive plantation system that shows evidence of entrepreneurship and creativity, but it doesn't expand to cities. And so that to me is like something really important to note. It's also like really fascinating to me if you look at where inventors are born at this time period. Only like 7% of all inventors, people who hold a patent, are born in the South. And so it's not as if the South is producing like these highly creative individuals, economically creative individuals, who are then moving to the North or to other areas. It does seem to be like there's a big pipeline problem that you're simply, in my interpretation, the education system and lack of literacy and lack of libraries and other institutions to kind of like encourage learning are really like preventing a pipeline of Southern inventors, which is really kind of like holding back as to holding back the South when it comes to widespread innovation.
Slavery hampered the creation of open access orders, and you're going to explain this for us in light of the Mercantile Library Association and the Charleston Library Society.
Yeah, so Charleston actually prides itself, Charleston, South Carolina, as a regional center of like science and learning. And so it has like, South Carolina College is there. I should say Charleston College is there. It has a major library, one of the larger libraries in the United States. But yet Charleston has like a super low patenting rate. And the reason is that those literary and learned institutions in Charleston are more or less the domain of the wealthy and well-to-do. And so if you look at the members of the Charleston Library, for example, they own large amounts of real estate. They tend to be very wealthy. They're always connected to prominent slaveholding families or kind of like local civic leaders. And in contrast, northern libraries, like the big libraries in New York City and in Boston and Philadelphia, pride themselves on attracting like thousands of members and really expanding access to literacy.
And they're less expensive. Charleston was expensive.
Yeah, so if you want to join the Charleston Library Society, you have to pay, I can't remember the exact figure, like $15, $20 a year, as well as kind of like an initial fee. Whereas in northern libraries, a few are free, but many it's like $1 or $2 a year. And so again, there's this like push in the north for inclusion, but in the South, there isn't the same push, and it's more like these institutions are more club-like for wealthy enslavers, as opposed to promoting literacy and science and learning throughout the society as a whole.
Yes. So Professor Majewski, I'm a big fan of your work. You should be able to know this by now. So far, we have been speaking for over 40 minutes. Usually I speak for 1 hour or less. People like shorter videos, so we're just going to speak for 14 minutes. It was a pleasure to speak to you. I really appreciate that you that you're on the show today. And I will be sharing it, and I hope that you share it too. But it's a pleasure to talk to you, John. Bye.
Bye. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, bye, John.
Bye-bye.